Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Ukraine Update with John Moran. I'm your host, Finbar Markey. Every week I'm joined by John Moran, former head of the foreign desk for the Irish Press. And John gives us an update on what's been happening in the NATO Russia-Ukraine war, and also looking at issues that may be connected to that internationally as well. Thanks for joining us, John.
My pleasure,
And
Finbar.
what have you got for us this week?
Well, this week we've seen finally that Artemovsk has finally fallen after a 200-day siege by the specialist Russian assault force, the Wagner Group. President Zelensky had placed much personal effort into maintaining the Ukrainian offensive in Artemovsk, despite reports that the army chief, General Zaluzhny, wanted to pull back from the city due to the extraordinary manpower losses. General Zaluzhny, reports say, has been seriously injured in a missile attack in early May. More than 55,000 Ukrainians died defending the city, which had earlier been described as our fortress by President Vladimir Zelensky, who took a personal interest there, even bringing a Ukrainian flag with the names of Bakhmut defenders written on it when he addressed US lawmakers. Reports say General Zaluzhny has been badly injured. It was reported yesterday that he had suffered life-changing head and other injuries and would not be returning to the army. Such were the levels of Ukrainian losses during the siege on the city that the much heralded Ukrainian counteroffensive has been put on indefinite hold until its forces can be built up to strength once again. Military experts say Artemovsk was a trap set by the Russians, and President Zelensky fell for it by relentlessly pushing his troops into it. The fall of Artemovsk is a huge personal blow to Zelensky, who will face an angry response for the massive losses of Ukrainian soldiers there. While Ukrainian forces in and around Bakhmut numbered 85,000, Wagner troops never rose above 50,000. Yet Ukraine had far higher losses than Russia in Artemovsk, where for 6 months, regiment after regiment were sent by Zelensky into the meat grinder and came back with a fraction of the force they began with. It's the same story all along the line of contact, where longer range Russian artillery and air power is a decisive advantage in this war of attrition. As of today, the Wagner Group have left Artemovsk to be rested. Soldiers of the Donetsk People's Republic have taken their place. A small pause in Russian operations is expected around Artemovsk before the offensive actions resume. Meanwhile, an obvious smokescreen operation in Belgorod border region of Russia was undertaken by Ukraine to divert attention away from the humiliating loss of Bakhmut. A company of 100 Ukrainian saboteurs invaded the Belgorod border region of Russia and took control of 3 settlements before being located and driven back over the border with very heavy losses. Some US armored vehicles were used in the attack, which has been embarrassing for the US. Russia initiated a robust anti-terrorist operation to defeat the saboteurs. A number of civilians were injured during the incursion, and an elderly man is reported to have died. Some 70 of the saboteurs were killed in the Russian anti-terrorist operation, during which 9 villages had to be evacuated. The US Secretary General, Stefan Durajik, called on all parties to prevent the escalation of hostilities in connection with events in the Belgorod region. Ironically, operations involving heavy loss of life, such as this one, which was intended to divert attention away from the Artemovsk defeat, again shows the same disregard for the lives of their own soldiers, as was seen on a much grander scale in Artemovsk. Washington has insisted that it does not encourage or enable strikes inside of Russia. Meanwhile, Russia released images of damaged and discarded Western military vehicles, including US-made Humvees, after the attack. Incredibly, Ukraine has denied involvement in the attack launched from its territory and with US armored vehicles. The provision of American F-16 fighter bomber aircraft is the latest in a line of so-called wonder weapons that were expected to be game changers for Ukraine during the war. First came the excellent M777 artillery pieces, then came the deadly accurate M142 HIMARS multiple rocket launchers. Next came the Patriot missile systems, and look what happened to them. One was destroyed in situ in Kiev recently. While all of these are excellent pieces of weaponry, Russia has the equivalent or better, and in much greater numbers. And in a war of attrition, it is numbers that count. G7's magical mystery tour in Japan. Events in Bakhmut were not far from the minds of the delegates attending the G7 summit that took place in Hiroshima in Japan, where it has plans to open an office. In the morning, Mr. Zelensky answered a question from a Reuters correspondent as to whether or not Ukraine was in control in Artemovsk. No, said Mr. Zelensky, only in our hearts. However, when Mr. Zelensky returned from a meeting with President Biden and State Department officials, Mr. Blinken and Mr. Sullivan, he had changed his mind. Ukrainian forces were still fighting in Artemovsk, he now claimed. What changed? Obviously, the American side did not want the fall of Bakhmut to rain on the G7 parade in Hiroshima, nor could the US justify a new €375 million military aid package, which was to be announced, given the tense negotiations taking place in Washington, D.C. on the debt ceiling. US critics could point to the loss of Artemovsk as throwing away US taxpayers' monies in a lost cause. So President Zelensky was forced by the bullish American side to do an about-turn on his earlier statement, arguing that Ukrainian forces were still fighting for this city. Meanwhile, on the name Bakhmut or Artemovsk, Bakhmut is Artemovsk's end of conversation, said Denis Pushlin, head of the Donetsk People's Republic, which he said on a visit to the city. Bakhmut is the name from the Russian Empire, but under the Soviet Union, it was called Artemovsk, and that's how we remember it, he said.
Whoa, there's a lot of news there, John. Bakhmut has fallen. We've spoken about it now since we started the show. This is our 20th show, I think, and we've been speaking about it for 20 weeks now. It's finally fallen, John. What's your opinion on it?
Well, I think if you look at how swiftly the world media has moved on from Bakhmut, or Artemovsk, as I should say now, I've got into a habit of calling it Bakhmut. But the situation there was always disastrous. I mean, General Zaluzhny had been arguing for months that they should withdraw from Artemovsk because they were losing such a high amount of soldiers. 55,000 in 200 days was phenomenal. Zelensky just kept pushing and pushing and pushing there. He had a personal attachment to the whole thing, and it almost acted as a substitute for an offensive action. And now it seems to me it has delayed or probably halted altogether the proposed Ukrainian offensive.
That 55,000 figure, that comes from the Wagner leader, does it, Prigozhin?
Well, not only does it come from him, but it was an independent source who also gave it the figure. I think he gave 50,000 and the other source gave 55,000. But either way, it's a phenomenal amount of people to lose, for something that you now say wasn't really that important anyway. It's been a disaster, that for Zelensky in particular. And I think he's going to have serious problems with his military now that they have lost Artemovsk. That would be a huge blow to them.
There's also, if we were to go by Prigozhin's figures, according to him and other analysts as well, I have to say, according to Prigozhin and other analysts, the odds were 2-1 in terms of numbers of troops against Russia. And normally to be able to take a city or to be able to win a battle, there's a very, very old adage that the odds should be 3-1 in your favor. You should have 3 times as many troops as your opposition or the enemy. But in this case, if Wagner alone took Bakhmut, and I think it would appear that they did take Bakhmut, then they did it against phenomenal odds in terms of manpower, not necessarily in terms of, even in terms of, Wagner do not have heavy armory. They don't have tanks or operate tanks. They don't have aircraft. So they are an assault brigade.
They do. They have aircraft. They have armored divisions as well. Okay. So they're not just strictly a frontline assault force. And even when they are, they will use their tanks in these battles. What is extraordinary about it is that this Ukrainian force that has been built up over 8 years, trained up to NATO standards, is considered to be the finest fighting force in NATO. And they have been humiliated by a private military company, which is slightly ironic given the former status of the Soviet Union.
I've seen commentary from Western media and politicos belittling the achievements, and I'm not glorifying or anything like that, war and death, but the fact that Wagner and the Russians have taken Bakhmut, they're belittling it, not just the prize itself of Bakhmut, but belittling Bakhmut in terms of its military capacity to defend in the first place. But in reality, what we know is Bakhmut was 8 years of the most sophisticated fortification building in the world took place in Bakhmut, because they were planning this, and we know that they were planning this all along. But they admit themselves, and right up until last February and beyond it, they were admitting that it was the most fortified area in the world, or one of the most fortified areas in the world, and yet it has fallen. What comes next? I'm told that there's a number of big towns that still have to come under control of the Russians to achieve their objectives.
What I took from reading the wires today was there's going to be a pause, a slight pause, and which would obviously be necessary, because if you're replacing 50,000 men, that's a lot of men and material, and that will take a long time. It struck me as being an ideal time for the Ukrainians to attack, better than any of the periods in the past while this new force of Donbass soldiers, regular soldiers from the Donbass who have been fighting since 2014, they have moved in. So I'm surprised that there hasn't been an immediate counterattack, because the changing of an army of that size is a huge operation and will cause a lot of problems for the people doing it.
But isn't there you can't believe what the Russians, or what Wagner in particular, say, because a part of the art of war is war propaganda and counterintelligence. And it would appear that Prigozhin pulled a textbook piece of counterintelligence and counter warfare through intelligence a couple of weeks ago, claiming that they had no ammunition and things like that, and to draw in Ukrainian troops. So it's hard to tell whether they really have fully pulled out or not. What do you think?
Well, I mean, that struck my mind as well, because if it was me and I was considering an offensive, if I was Russian, I would use that period to bring in another 50,000 troops and use that then as your offensive fist.
Yeah.
So it could be used in that way too by the Russians, to feign a replacement and to really enhance the group that is there.
Yeah. And what about this Belgorod business of a Ukrainian unit crossing into Belgorod and seizing some Russian territory for a very temporary amount of time? What do you make of that? That's That's just diversion, isn't it?
It's a diversion, but it's worse. It's a horrendous waste of life. There's about 70 people lost their lives doing that. For what? So that people wouldn't concentrate on the loss of Bakhmut? That's a terrible way of doing things. You'd sacrifice people's lives in such large numbers for that, for a PR job, which appears to be what is exactly has happened.
Yeah. And
But
claiming
there's
that it was some
nothing
kind
to
of
be
a
gained by that at all.
and claiming that it was some kind of a Russian nationalist group, although they were using American equipment, Ukrainian language, and things like that. But there were some known Russian neo-Nazis in the group, apparently. And so this was, again, a kit together of some of the most extremist elements within Europe in terms of right-wing supremacy and things like that. Did you see reports that there were nationalists, radical extremist nationalists involved?
Yes, the reason why they pick these is because they're the most enthusiastic about killing Russians, and they will go for it at the drop of a hat. So they're chosen first. Like Azov is often chosen as being an assault battalion, and others of a similar far right mentality are also chosen for the same reason. They hate Russians more than anyone else.
And this Kraken group as well, who
Oh
are
yeah,
supposed to be the worst of the worst. On that subject, John, I have an image here of a general, Andreas Marlow or Marlov. I don't know, not very good at German. He's a German general, and he has there's reports going around Twitter, and I'm working on confirming them and trying to get a video footage of him saying something himself. Where reports are going around that he has reported to members of the German government that when training Ukrainian soldiers in Germany, he has been shocked at the video footage that those Ukrainian soldiers have been showing each other, German soldiers and their officers, etc., of them torturing Russian soldiers. And these videos seem to be very, very plentiful, and he's very worried about it. He's also very worried about the Nazi ideals that are presented to him by these people coming from training from Ukraine and officers as well. So this is a picture of the general anyway. We'll just have a quick look at him here. He is risking his job and possibly even his life in what he's doing. Again, as I say, we do have to confirm this, but General Andreas Marlow will watch this story over the next week. I'm not sure if you have come across this yet, John.
I did, yes, and apparently he came across numerous videos of torture and humiliation of Russian prisoners of war. And this upset him so much he went to his superiors. But it appears to me as if his superiors are dampening the whole thing down, which is outrageous.
In fact, it would appear that there's a complete hush hush on the whole story. It's been hushed up in Germany, but some journalists are starting to raise the issue. So the source that I got it from, a Twitter source, had written an article based on the links he has with some German journalists who may very soon be breaking this story publicly in Germany. But we will follow this up anyway because it's very important. The idea that a top military commander in the EU and in a NATO country is risking his job to bring these things to light and confirming what many of us have been saying and have gathered evidence of over the last while ourselves, or seen evidence of. Something is upsetting some of the mainstream media in Ireland and the politicians, and it's this poll. It's an Ipsos poll, so it's not a poll done by some crank who put up his own poll on Twitter. This is a properly conducted poll, and it asked the question: are you in favour or not in favour of a ceasefire to facilitate negotiations between Russia and Ukraine to end the war? In favour, 87%. Not in favour, 8%, whoever those miserable sods are, and no opinion, 5%. So it's just an amazing. I wouldn't have guessed 87% because of the level of anti-Russian campaigning and propaganda that the Irish people, and also propaganda to abandon our neutrality and things like that as well, and pressure to join NATO. And our politicians seem to be doing it despite public opinion to the contrary over the history of the state. What do you make of this poll, John?
Well, I think politicians will have to stand back and take a second look, because if that is the opinion of the Irish people, then they're in big trouble, because they have been acting as if it was the opposite way around, as if it was only a tiny percentage who didn't want the war to end, when it's the reverse. These things should be taken very seriously. And it'll be interesting to see if any newspaper tries to do a follow up poll.
Yeah, yeah. And again, the maximum pressure, I believe, is being applied at the moment. I can't see any other type of pressure that could be placed on the Irish people to get involved in this war, to abandon our state history length position of neutrality on international things like this. Though I am a believer that agencies from outside the state have got involved in Irish affairs in the past and have orchestrated catastrophes and massacres in Ireland to drive forward particular political processes in the past. I wouldn't be surprised if they tried something like this into the near future. They're already trying to suggest to us that we're being surrounded by Russian submarines and there's Russian ships just off the coast and Russian aircraft are flying overhead as though we're being invaded or something. What do you think, John? How far do you think they will go to convince the Irish people to get involved?
Well, it remains to be seen. Like, I'm looking at the little things that are happening in Europe, for example. They're trying to get rid of the unanimous voting system, because if one country blocks something, then the whole thing stops. They want to end that.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, John, that's all we have for this week from Ukraine Update. You can also tune in, folks. We also publish a World Update program looking at international affairs. You can tune into that. That'll go out as well this week. Thanks again for joining us for Ukraine Update, John.
Bye bye. Thank you, Finbar.